John Gotti. In July of 1996, deep inside the highest security prison in the federal system, the most famous mafia boss in America was punched to the ground by another inmate. Within days, that inmate had a price on his head, and the men Gotti had hired to collect it were members of the Aryan Brotherhood. The contract came out of a cell inside USP Marion, the federal control unit built to replace Alcatraz. And to understand how a mob boss ended up ordering a hit from a place where the government had already taken almost everything from him, you have to go back to the beginning. John Gotti was born in October of 1940 in the Bronx and grew up poor. He drifted into the Ozone Park crews of Queens as a teenager and became a protégé of Gambino underboss Agnello Della Croce. By his 40s, he was a made man in one of the most powerful crime families in the country. The rise to the top came on the sidewalk outside a Manhattan steakhouse called Sparks in December of 1985. Paul Castellano, then boss of the Gambinos, was shot to death as he stepped out of his car. Gotti watched the whole thing from across the street. Within weeks, he had taken over the family. For 6 years, no jury in America could touch him. 3 separate acquittals earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. He was flashy, quotable, and photographed on the courthouse steps in tailored suits, waving at reporters. Prosecutors treated him as a personal insult. Then, in April of 1992, his underboss, Salvatore Gravano, better known as Sammy the Bull, flipped. Gotti was convicted of 5 murders including Castellanos, plus racketeering, loan sharking, and obstruction. The sentence was life without parole. Within 24 hours of sentencing, the Bureau of Prisons put him on a plane to southern Illinois. USP Marion at that time was the only Level 6 facility in the federal system and had been on permanent lockdown since 2 correctional officers were murdered by Aryan Brotherhood inmates back in 1983. Gotti was placed in near-total isolation. An 8x10 cell, a small black-and-white television, and roughly 1 hour a day outside those walls. For 4 years, he served that sentence quietly. Then, on July 18, 1996, in the small recreation area where a handful of the prison's most restricted inmates were allowed to gather, a black inmate named Walter Johnson walked up to Gotti and knocked him to the ground with a single punch. Reporting at the time suggested Gotti had used a racial slur the day before. Johnson's response was, by Marion standards, restrained. Gotti's response was not. Word went out to 2 Aryan Brotherhood members housed at Marion, David Sahakian and Michael McElhiney. Gotti wanted Johnson dead, and he was willing to pay. Testimony at the later federal racketeering trial of the Brotherhood put the offer somewhere between $100,000 and $500,000. Barry Mills, the gang's leader at ADX Florence and known inside the ranks as the Baron, personally approved the contract. According to testimony from AB turncoat Kevin Roach, Mills told his people Johnson was to be killed at all costs, to prove to every prison in America that the Brotherhood could reach anyone, anywhere. The hit never happened. Johnson was quietly moved out of Marion within weeks, transferred through several federal facilities, and eventually paroled. Prosecutor Michael Emick would later say, at the sprawling 2006 Aryan Brotherhood trial in Santa Ana, California, that picking a fight with an organized crime figure was probably not a good idea. And no, I'm not making that up. The Bloody Yard incident with Walter Johnson became one of the central threads in the federal government's decade-long dismantling of the Brotherhood. Gotti never left federal supermax life. In 1998, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Doctors removed part of his jaw and neck. He was transferred to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where he spent the last few years of his life. He died there on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, weighing barely 100 pounds. The Teflon Don never beat that final case. Gotti's crime was not the only reason he ended up in Marion. Years before his plane ever landed in Illinois, another man was already in the same corridor of the prison, and the damage he had done to the United States was measured in something else entirely. Not bodies, but decades of naval intelligence sold to Moscow, one photograph at a time, by a chief warrant officer whose greatest talent was making everyone around him trust him. John Anthony Walker, Jr. If you had spent time in the crypto room of an American naval vessel in the 1970s or early 80s, there is a real chance the messages passing through your hands were also passing through Moscow within days. The reason for that was one man. His name was John Anthony Walker, Jr., a chief warrant officer with the United States Navy, and by the time the FBI arrested him in 1985, he had run one of the most damaging espionage rings in American history. He had also recruited his best friend, his older brother, and his own son to spy alongside him. Walker was born in July of 1937 in Washington, D.C. He joined the Navy in 1955, climbed to chief warrant officer, and specialized in communications. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of career sailor the service was built on. In practice, by the mid-1960s, his personal finances were falling apart, and his marriage was disintegrating. In December of 1967, Walker walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington with a stack of cipher material and offered to sell more. The KGB accepted. What followed was almost 2 decades of continuous betrayal. Walker sold cryptographic key lists, technical manuals, and the specifications for the machines the Navy used to encode almost every one of its transmissions. When his own access ran low, he began recruiting. First, his older brother Arthur, a retired Navy lieutenant commander. Then his close friend Jerry Whitworth, a communications specialist assigned to aircraft carriers. And in 1983, his own son Michael, then serving as a seaman aboard the USS Nimitz. Estimates of what Walker gave Moscow are almost impossible to overstate. Using the material he provided, the Soviets are believed to have decrypted more than 1 million American naval messages over the life of the ring. KGB defector Vitaly Yurchenko later told his American handlers that Walker's case was the greatest in the history of Soviet intelligence, and that if a war had broken out during those years, they would have won it at sea. In 1987, the New York Times described the Walker ring as, in the view of many analysts, the most damaging Soviet spy operation in American history. The tip that ended it did not come from a foreign source. It came from Walker's ex-wife, Barbara, who had known for years and finally called the FBI. Walker was arrested at a Maryland motel on May 20th, 1985. Sitting near a dead drop stuffed with classified documents wrapped in a garbage bag. He pleaded guilty in a deal that secured a lighter sentence for his son Michael. He himself received life. By the late 1980s, Walker was housed at USP Marion. His placement there had nothing to do with anything he had done inside the walls. It was where the federal government kept its most damaging spies, because after what he had sold, isolation was the point of the sentence. His years in the control unit made him one of the highest-profile spies ever confined at Marion. In 1990, he gave a rare interview to CBS's 60 Minutes from inside the maximum security walls, still calm, still strangely unrepentant, comparing his crimes to those of a corporate insider who traded on secrets. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who had lived through the fallout of the Walker case in real time as the head of the Pentagon, summed up the damage more bluntly. He said Walker had given the Soviets access to American weapons systems, sensor data, and naval tactics on a scale the country would still be assessing years later. That's not a typo, by the way. A single chief warrant officer had rewritten the intelligence balance between the United States and its largest strategic rival. Walker was eventually moved from Marion to the Federal Prison Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He died there on August 28, 2014, at the age of 77. He had been scheduled to come up for parole within the year. Retired FBI agent Robert Hunter, one of the men who had chased him for years, reacted to news of the death by saying it could not have happened to a nicer guy. If Walker was Marion's quietest headline, the next man on this list was arguably its loudest. He was not a spy. He was a hijacker, a con artist, and a serial escape artist with a taste for the impossible. And the plan cooked up to spring him from Marion involved a stolen helicopter, a Vietnam veteran pilot, and a shootout in a prison yard. Garrett Brock Trapnell. On the afternoon of May 24, 1978, a woman named Barbara Ann Oswald walked onto a charter helicopter at Lambert Airport in St. Louis, drew a pistol on the pilot, and told him to fly south to the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. She was going to break her friend out of prison. Her friend was Garrett Brock Trapnell, and what nobody in that helicopter knew was that Trapnell had already tried to escape from Marion before, and that 7 months later, Oswald's teenage daughter would try to break him out again, this time by hijacking a Boeing 727. Trapnell was born in January of 1938 into a distinguished military and aviation family. He grew up unstable, drifted into crime early, and spent his adult life perfecting one specific talent. He knew how to game psychiatric evaluations. Con man, bank robber, hijacker, and repeated pretender to insanity, he escaped from institutions almost as often as he was placed in them. On January 28, 1972, Trapnell hijacked TWA Flight 2 en route from Los Angeles to New York, using a pistol hidden inside a plaster arm cast. He demanded $306,800 in cash, the release of political prisoner Angela Davis, and a personal pardon from President Richard Nixon. FBI agents shot and captured him after the plane landed at JFK. After a hung jury and a retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to life. He was sent to Marion. By 1978, Trapnell had become friends with Barbara Ann Oswald, a woman who had been visiting inmates at Marion as an ostensible pen pal volunteer and had grown obsessed with him. That May, she showed up at Lambert Airport, chartered a Bell helicopter, and drew her pistol on the pilot as soon as they were airborne. His name was Alan Barclage, and he was a decorated Vietnam veteran. As Barclage began the descent into the airspace over Marion's prison yard, he waited for Oswald to look away, then wrestled her for the weapon. In the struggle, he shot her dead. He landed the helicopter with her body inside. Behind the walls, Trapnell had been waiting for the helicopter to touch down, along with a fellow inmate named Martin McNally, another convicted hijacker. Neither of them made it out. Trapnell was placed under what the Bureau of Prisons called a no-human contact order. He would spend most of the rest of his life inside a solitary cell. Then, on December 21, 1978, Barbara Oswald's 17-year-old daughter Robin boarded TWA Flight 541. She claimed to have a bundle of dynamite strapped to her body and demanded the release of Garrett Brock Trapnell. FBI negotiators worked her down over several hours. The dynamite turned out to be railroad flares. Nobody was hurt. The Marion regime after that was engineered around him. Trapnell later gave a rare interview to ABC News, in which he laid out his philosophy without apology. Escaping, he said, was as American as apple pie, and if he had actually made it out on that helicopter, the country would have loved him for it. He never got the chance to test that theory. Garrett Brock Trapnell died on September 7, 1993, of emphysema at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, the same medical facility that would later house John Gotti in his final days. He was 55. By the early 1980s, Marion had another headline inmate walking its corridors. But unlike Trapnell, this one had already become famous long before he arrived. His face had been on movie posters, played by Timothy Hutton. His story had been dramatized in a major Hollywood film called The Falcon and the Snowman. And the reason he ended up at Marion was that even inside a federal supermax, the Aryan Brotherhood had decided he was not going to live much longer. Christopher Boyce. The story most Americans know about Christopher Boyce is the one Hollywood told. Two young men from a wealthy Southern California suburb passing American spy satellite secrets to the Soviets through a dead drop in Mexico City, one of them wearing a heavy overcoat in the summer heat. The Falcon and the Snowman. What Hollywood mostly left out of that story was what happened to Boyce after his famous escape from a California federal prison. Because when the U.S. Marshals finally caught him again, and the Aryan Brotherhood tried to kill him inside another federal penitentiary, the Bureau of Prisons decided there was really only one place left to put him. That place was Marion. Boyce was born in February of 1953 and raised in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. His father was a former FBI agent turned security director at defense contractor McDonnell Douglas. Boyce was hired at another defense contractor, TRW, at the age of 21 in 1974. He was given a top-secret clearance and assigned to a classified cipher room called the Black Vault, where he handled communications with American spy satellites. He hated what he saw. Boyce would later say he had watched his own government routinely deceive its closest allies, including a documented CIA role in the 1975 ouster of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and he decided he wanted to make a point. His childhood friend Andrew Dalton Lee, a small-time drug dealer nicknamed the Snowman, became his courier. Together they sold TRW satellite manuals, key lists, and cipher machine specifications to the Soviets through their embassy in Mexico City. Boyce was arrested in 1977 and sentenced to 40 years for espionage. In January of 1980, Boyce broke out of FCI Lompoc, the federal prison in Central California. Then, using survival and pilot training skills he had studied inside the prison library, he vanished into the Pacific Northwest and robbed 17 banks across Idaho and Washington state over the next 19 months. He was recaptured in August of 1981 at a drive-in restaurant in Port Angeles, Washington. The court added another 28 years to his sentence. He was sent first to Leavenworth. Almost immediately, 3 Aryan Brotherhood inmates attacked him. According to federal appellate court records in the case of Boyce versus Ashcroft, decided by the 10th Circuit in 2001, the Bureau of Prisons then transferred him to USP Marion, in the court's own language, for his protection. That was in 1982. He would remain inside Marion, in isolation, until 1988. 6 years in the underground control unit of the federal system's only Level 6 prison. From that cell, in 1985, he gave sworn testimony to the U.S. Senate on the growing threat of insider spies. He also spoke in his own quiet way about what had driven him in the first place. He said his government had been deceiving an ally, and he had come to believe it was indicative of what his country had sunk to. Boyce was moved from Marion to Oak Park Heights in Minnesota in 1988, and eventually paroled on September 16, 2002, after 25 years. He is alive. He lives quietly in Oregon. He resumed the falconry that had given him his nickname as a teenager, and in 2013 he co-wrote a book about his life. That's not a typo, by the way. The most famous spy of his generation is now a middle-aged birder in the Pacific Northwest. But Boyce was not the only spy the federal government tried to bury inside Marion's underground. There was another cell in another subterranean unit of the same prison in the late 1980s, one that a high-profile defense attorney would later compare to a place Hannibal Lecter would have felt right at home in. And the man inside it was serving a life sentence for selling American secrets to a country that was supposed to be an ally. Jonathan Pollard. Before Jonathan Pollard was sentenced in March of 1987, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Caspar Weinberger, wrote a classified memo to the federal judge on his case. In that memo, Weinberger told the court that even in what people were then calling the Year of the Spy, he could not conceive of a greater harm to American national security than what Pollard had done. Judge Aubrey Robinson, Jr. read that memo and gave Pollard life in prison. A little more than a year later, they put him underground. Pollard was born in August of 1954 in Galveston, Texas, and grew up steeped in his Jewish identity. He joined the U.S. Navy as a civilian intelligence analyst in 1979, and by 1984, he was assigned to the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center, an office with access to a staggering amount of American signals intelligence material. From June of 1984 to November of 1985, Pollard smuggled classified material out of the center on a scale investigators would later struggle to fully quantify. Estimates from the damage assessments filed with the court put the numbers at roughly 800 classified publications and more than 1,000 cables and messages, including the NSA's Signals Intelligence Reference Manual, known as RASIN. He passed all of it to Israeli handlers. He was arrested on November 21, 1985, outside the Israeli embassy in Washington after his handlers refused to grant him asylum. He pleaded guilty as part of a deal. But when he arrived for sentencing in March of 1987, Judge Robinson set the effective terms of that deal aside and imposed a life sentence. Prosecutor Joseph DiGenova, years later, called any move toward Pollard's early release an outright disgrace. Pollard spent his first months at the Springfield Federal Medical Center undergoing psychiatric evaluation. Then, in June of 1988, he was transferred to USP Marion and placed in a unit called K Unit. K Unit was underground. It sat at the deepest security level of the entire federal system and was described by his own attorneys as the most tightly guarded housing area at Marion. Alan Dershowitz, one of the lawyers who took up Pollard's cause over the years, would later say the conditions there were the kind of environment in which Hannibal Lecter would have felt right at home. Pollard stayed inside that unit until 1993, when he was finally moved to the medium-security federal prison at Butner, North Carolina. That was where he served the rest of his time. 5 years underground, at the bottom of Marion, in the same underground corridor that had held Christopher Boyce a few years before him. You'd think someone would have said something about the conditions. Almost nobody did. Pollard was paroled on November 20, 2015, after 30 years in federal custody. His parole restrictions expired in 2020. In December of that same year, he and his wife boarded a private jet and flew to Israel. He is alive. He lives near Jerusalem. Israel welcomed him as a hero. If you're getting something out of this video and you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to hit the button. It really helps the channel keep making these kinds of videos. Victor Bout. For most of the 1990s and the early 2000s, if a warlord in Africa or a paramilitary commander in Central Asia needed a shipment of weapons delivered to an airstrip nobody was watching, there was one man who would take the call. British Foreign Minister Peter Hain gave him the nickname the Merchant of Death, and former DEA Operations Chief Michael Braun would later describe him as one of the most dangerous men on the face of the earth. In 2008, in a hotel conference room in Bangkok, American agents finally got within reach of him. Victor Bout was born on January 13, 1967, in Dushanbe, then part of the Soviet Union. He served as a Soviet military officer and translator, spoke half a dozen languages, and after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, he built one of the largest private cargo airline operations in the world. On paper, he moved legitimate freight. In practice, his fleet supplied warlords and rebel movements across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East for over a decade. The DEA sting that ended his run was elaborate. Undercover agents posed as buyers for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. They contacted Bout through intermediaries and told him they wanted anti-aircraft missiles, thousands of assault rifles, and enough ordnance to shoot American helicopters out of the sky. Bout took the meeting. It was held on March 6, 2008, in a fifth-floor conference room at the Sofitel Selim Hotel in Bangkok, and Thai police walked in and arrested him mid-conversation. Extradition took 2 years. Bout finally arrived in New York in November of 2010. He was tried in Manhattan Federal Court and convicted in November of 2011 on charges including conspiracy to kill American officers, delivering anti-aircraft missiles, and providing material support to a designated terrorist organization. The judge sentenced him to the mandatory minimum, 25 years. The Bureau of Prisons sent him to USP Marion in June of 2012. He was placed in the Communication Management Unit, one of only 2 such units in the federal system, where every phone call, letter, and visit was monitored and severely restricted. He was allowed 2 phone calls a week and no contact visits with family. In January of 2020, according to reporting from his wife Alla, he was moved back into a Supermax-style unit within the prison. For years, he was housed alongside general population inmates, where by most accounts he was quiet and non-confrontational. He spent his time learning languages, practicing yoga, and drawing. Nicholas Schmeidel of The New Yorker profiled him inside Marion in 2014 after 4 in-person interviews and painted a picture of a man who had, in his own strange way, made himself comfortable inside a Supermax. Before sentencing, Bout had told Schmeidel that the American government would try to lock him away for the rest of his life, but that he would get back to Russia eventually. He just did not know when. The when came on December 8, 2022. In a one-for-one prisoner swap negotiated between the Biden administration and Moscow. Bout was walked off a plane on the tarmac at Al Bateen Executive Airport in Abu Dhabi. Walking in the other direction, boarding an American aircraft to fly home, was WNBA star Brittany Griner. Bout returned to Russia, joined the ultra-nationalist LDPR party, and won a seat in a regional legislature in 2023. And somehow, it gets worse. Reports in October of 2024 alleged that he had quietly returned to the arms trade. Bout was Marion's most famous international prisoner. The next man on this list was Marion's most famous American writer. He had corresponded from behind the walls with Norman Mailer. He had published a book about the American prison system that made him a literary celebrity of the early 1980s, and he had killed at least twice. Jack Henry Abbott. In the summer of 1981, one of the most talked-about writers in New York City was a man who had spent almost every year of his life since the age of 12 inside an institution. His book, In the Belly of the Beast, was being reviewed on the front page of the New York Times. Norman Mailer had personally championed his release, and 6 weeks after he walked out of federal prison on parole, he stabbed a 22-year-old waiter to death on a Manhattan sidewalk over a dispute about using the restaurant bathroom. Jack Henry Abbott was born in January of 1944 in Oscoda, Michigan. He was placed in foster care as a small child, sent to a juvenile facility at 12, and moved almost seamlessly into the adult prison system as a teenager. By his own description, he was a state-raised convict, someone who had never known life outside of a cell. He drew his first serious adult sentence in 1963 in Utah for check forgery. 3 years later, inside that same prison, he stabbed another inmate to death and picked up a manslaughter conviction. In 1971, he escaped, robbed a bank in Denver, and was given 19 years in federal prison for the robbery. That federal sentence eventually landed him at USP Marion. He was there in the late 1970s, transferred in the summer of 1979 after a hunger strike, and was disciplined constantly. But it was inside Marion's control unit that he became the writer he became. He began corresponding with Norman Mailer, who was then finishing his own book about a convict, The Executioner's Song. Mailer read Abbott's letters and became convinced he was reading a serious literary voice. Abbott also reportedly cooperated with prison staff during that period, providing information on a drug smuggling operation and on the organizers of the 1980 and 81 Marion work strikes, in exchange for what he hoped would be a parole date. Those letters were published in 1981 as the book In the Belly of the Beast. Its jacket listed his history at Leavenworth, Atlanta, and Marion. It received the kind of critical reception that changes a person's life. Reviews called it the most honest account of American prison life ever written. Mailer used his fame to advocate for Abbott's release. The Federal Parole Board listened. Abbott was released in June of 1981. 6 weeks later, on the night of July 18th, 22-year-old Richard Adden, a waiter and aspiring playwright at a Manhattan cafe called the Binnibon, told Abbott the bathroom was for staff only. The two men stepped outside. Abbott stabbed Adden on the sidewalk. Adden died at the scene. Abbott fled. He was arrested weeks later in Louisiana. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years to life. This time, no one advocated for him. Mailer, questioned by reporters years later after Abbott's death, would say he had never known a man whose life had been more tragic from beginning to end. That's not a typo, by the way. Even the man who had championed him back into the world could not defend what had come out of that decision. Abbott hanged himself in his cell at the Wende Correctional Facility in Alden, New York, on February 10, 2002. A New York State Parole Board had, a few months earlier, cited a lifetime record of antisocial behavior and criminality, escalating to extreme violence. Abbott's crimes had been personal. The next man to arrive at Marion had built something on a scale that put him in a category by himself. He had run one of the largest street gangs in Chicago from behind bars, converted it into a religious organization, then converted that organization into something the federal government had never charged an American with before. He had offered its services, from a prison phone, to the government of Libya. Jeff Fort. In 1986, federal investigators in Chicago began quietly listening to a series of collect calls being placed from a low-security prison in Bastrop, Texas. The inmate on the line was serving 13 years on a drug conviction. The people on the other end were the leaders of one of the largest street organizations in the American Midwest. And what the men were discussing, in coded language, was a proposal from the government of Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was offering $2.5 million for terrorist attacks committed inside the United States. The inmate on the phone was Jeff Fort, and he was about to become the first American citizen ever charged with committing acts of terrorism inside the United States on behalf of a foreign power. Jeff Fort was born in February of 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi. His family moved to the south side of Chicago when he was young. As a teenager, he co-founded the Blackstone Rangers, later renamed the Black P. Stone Nation, one of the most powerful street gangs in the country. In prison in the 1970s, he converted to Islam, took the name Abdul Malik Kaaba, and refounded the organization as a religious body called the El Rukns, headquartered in a converted movie theater on the South Side. Fort was convicted on a federal drug charge in 1983 and sent to a federal correctional institution in Bastrop, Texas. From that facility, and by way of an endless stream of collect calls, he continued to direct El Rukn business. In 1986, El Rukn lieutenants met with Libyan officials, ostensibly diplomats, and offered to carry out attacks against American targets in exchange for Libyan funding. FBI wiretaps, aided by an informant inside the organization, captured most of the planning. In 1987, Fort and 4 lieutenants were convicted of conspiring to commit terrorist acts inside the United States on behalf of a foreign government. Federal prosecutors emphasized in their opening statements that no American citizen had ever been charged under that theory before. Fort's own defense attorneys, gamely, compared the El Rukns to a fraternal organization like the Knights of Columbus. He was sentenced to 80 years for the terrorism conspiracy. In 1988, he received an additional 75 years for having ordered a 1981 murder. His aggregate sentence has been reported variously as 155 and 168 years. More than a century and a half in total. Because Fort had already demonstrated the ability to run an international terror-adjacent conspiracy by prison telephone, the federal government wanted him somewhere they could turn the phone off. He was transferred to USP Marion. He was, by then, exactly the kind of inmate the Marion regime had been designed for. In 2006, when the Bureau of Prisons formally handed off its highest restriction population to ADX Florence in Colorado, Fort went with them. He is still alive. He has been held under a no-human contact order at ADX Florence for close to 2 decades. In October of 2023, U.S. District Judge John Tharp denied Fort's bid for compassionate release. Fort was 76 years old at the time of that hearing. He remains inside the underground control unit at Florence, in a cell not much different from the one he had at Marion. Fort's contact with Libya was an international story. The next man on this list did not build a criminal organization. He built a militia in the interior of Alaska. He ran for the state legislature. And by the time he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in federal prison, the Bureau of Prisons would classify his mail so tightly that even Amnesty International would take notice. Francis Schaefer Cox. In March of 2011, FBI agents and Alaska state troopers arrested a Fairbanks handyman and militia leader named Francis Schaefer Cox on charges of conspiring to kill federal officials and stockpiling illegal weapons. 2 years later, at his sentencing hearing, he stood in front of a federal judge and told the court that some of what had come out of his own mouth had been horrible, and that he had put a lot of people in real fear. He was sentenced to nearly 26 years in federal prison. Then the Bureau of Prisons put him in a place that most law-abiding Americans did not know existed. Cox was born in February of 1984. He grew up in Fairbanks, worked as a handyman, and ran unsuccessfully for the Alaska State Legislature in 2008. In the years that followed, he founded a group called the Alaska Peacemakers Militia and a second group called the Second Amendment Task Force. He drew a following of people convinced that the federal government was preparing to enforce gun laws through violence and that they should be ready. 2 informants, working with the FBI and Alaska state troopers, spent months inside his organization. According to the eventual federal indictment, Cox and his associates discussed what they called a 2-for-1 plan. For every militia member the government arrested or killed, they would kill 2 federal officials in return, including judges, marshals, and prosecutors. They stockpiled weapons and grenades in preparation. He was arrested on March 10, 2011. Cox was convicted in 2012 of conspiracy to commit murder and multiple weapons charges. Federal prosecutor Stephen Scrocky, arguing for a long sentence, told the court that for every claim of a Gandhi in Cox's speeches, there had been a corresponding claim of a Rambo. On January 8, 2013, Cox was sentenced to 310 months in federal custody. That is a shade under 26 years. In 2017, on appeal, the Ninth Circuit vacated one of his convictions for solicitation of murder, but upheld the conspiracy count. He is currently serving out the remainder of his aggregate sentence subject to resentencing. The Bureau of Prisons sent him to USP Marion and placed him in the Communication Management Unit. The CMU is one of only 2 such units in the federal system, and its stated purpose is to monitor and restrict every communication that enters or leaves the cell. Almost every inmate housed in a CMU is either Muslim or a designated domestic threat. It has been criticized by civil liberties organizations for years. From inside that unit, Cox wrote to Amnesty International describing himself as a political prisoner and describing the CMU as a highly secretive federal facility for political and high-profile inmates. He objected in particular to the ban on physical contact with visitors, which meant that his young son could not touch him. He continued to grant interviews to reporters through the mail and to argue in public filings that the government's case against him had been an entrapment operation from the start. He is alive. Reporting variously places him at Marion and at the 2nd Federal CMU inside Terre Haute, Indiana. His original release date was set at approximately October of 2033. The exact date is subject to the pending resentencing following the Ninth Circuit's ruling. You'd think someone would have said something publicly about the CMUs by now. Almost nobody, outside of Amnesty and a small number of civil liberties advocates, has. Cox's letters from the CMU had complained about the ban on human contact with his family. The last man on this list would spend more than a decade at Marion under conditions that were even more restrictive, and he would refuse to work for the prison industry on principle the entire time. Oscar Lopez Rivera. Between 1974 and 1983, a Puerto Rican independence movement called the FALN, short in Spanish for the Armed Forces of National Liberation, carried out more than 130 bombings inside the United States. 5 people were killed. 84 were wounded. Bank offices, government buildings, restaurants, and courthouses were targeted, most of them in New York City and Chicago. The federal government spent years trying to build a case against the movement's leadership. And when they finally did, one of the men they convicted was an Army veteran and Bronze Star recipient who would go on to spend more time in federal prison than anyone else associated with the group. Oscar Lopez Rivera was born on January 6, 1943, in Puerto Rico. He served in the Vietnam War as an American soldier and received a Bronze Star. After returning home, he settled in Chicago and became a community organizer, a school teacher, and eventually a leading figure in the Puerto Rican independence movement. Federal prosecutors would later allege that he had also become one of the FALN's recruiters and bomb-making instructors. He was arrested on May 29, 1981, and convicted on August 11th of that same year of seditious conspiracy, armed robbery, and interstate transportation of firearms. He was not charged in connection with any specific bombing or death. He was charged with running the organization. His sentence was 55 years. In 1988, he was convicted of a conspiracy to escape federal custody and given another 15 years. From roughly 1986 through 1999, Lopez Rivera was housed inside the highest security tiers of the federal prison system, first at USP Marion and later at ADX Florence in Colorado. Inside Marion, he engaged in a specific act of political resistance that other inmates rarely did. He refused to work for Unicor, the Federal Prison Industries Program. Unicor paid inmate labor pennies on the hour to manufacture goods on federal contract. At Marion, one of the products being made was coaxial cable for the American military. Lopez Rivera would not touch it. The refusal earned him extended stretches in the disciplinary unit. In 1999, President Bill Clinton offered clemency to a group of imprisoned FALN members. Lopez Rivera turned it down. His reasoning, given later in interviews, was straightforward. The offer did not extend to two of his co-defendants, and he had learned in Vietnam that you did not leave people behind. He served another 18 years in prison. On January 17, 2017, in one of his final acts before leaving office, President Barack Obama commuted the remainder of Lopez Rivera's sentence. He was released to house arrest and freed outright on May 17, 2017. He had served approximately 36 years in federal custody, more than any other FALN member. The commutation was not without controversy. Tom Connor, the son of a man killed in the 1975 FALN bombing of Francis Tavern in Lower Manhattan, told reporters he could not understand what it was about Democratic presidents that made them want to release people convicted of terrorism. Congressman Luis Gutierrez called Lopez Rivera a national hero. Both statements ran in the same news cycles. Lopez Rivera returned home to Puerto Rico. He is alive. 10 men, 1 prison in southern Illinois. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.